there will be no further restrictions in England before New Year, according to Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary. The Health Secretary has said that people should remain cautious and celebrate outside on New Year's Eve if possible. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that ministers will continue to monitor the data and urge people to get their first, second or booster jab without delay. Question is, did they make the right call? Let's speak to Dr. Peter English, retired public health consultant, and he joins me now. Dr. Peter, very good morning to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Talk Radio. So, the Prime Minister has now finally made his decision. New Year's Eve celebrations in England go ahead. Has he made the right call?
I'm afraid I don't think he has. I think we should be restricting our contacts, keeping them to a minimum. I think going to large events is certainly a bad idea. We know Omicron is a lot more infectious. There have been concerts outdoors where people are all wearing masks and having to be tested, where there has been a lot of spread. So even outdoors with Omicron, the risk seems to be higher. So people should be wearing masks at big events outdoors. As you know, they aren't. We see them in shops and places. We should be rigorously enforcing these with big fines for people who persistently refuse to wear masks in public spaces indoors. The reason I'm saying all this is because we have colossal case rates. If you look at the curves for how many cases there are, they're shooting up. There's a lot of people saying it's mild. Mild means not ill enough to need admission to hospital. You have a lot more cases. A slightly smaller proportion might be admitted to hospital, but with a lot more cases, that overrides the smaller proportion being admitted. You still have a lot more admitted to hospital. What it's going to mean is that people with cancer aren't going to get the surgery they need to treat it. It means people with heart attacks and strokes are going to get delays in treatment, which will mean that they die or they do a lot worse because they don't get their clot busters in time. It means that all the other things that the NHS does will be slowed down or won't happen because COVID-19 cases will be taking over and they'll be doing very little other than that.
Yeah, but hang on a second. But if people are not being hospitalised, and why are we worried about the case numbers?
People are being hospitalised.
Yes, but they're not particularly. If you have a look at the numbers of people in hospital, yes, they've risen since the beginning. But if you actually have a look at the hospital numbers, so it's gone up by 12%, and we've got 7,000 or 8,000 people in hospital. We don't know whether it's with or from COVID. That compares to 30,000+ at the end of January. It's nothing like it was before. This is a massive overreaction.
The problem with these things is if you don't act soon, act early, you get the consequences come in 2 or 3 weeks' time. It might not look that bad now, but the effect by mid-January, particularly if people go out and have mass super spreading events on New Year's Eve, is going to be colossal on the NHS. It's all very well saying, oh, it's not that bad now, but we know from previous experience that that's what leads to it being a lot worse in 2 or 3 weeks' time.
With respect, we don't know, because what was the point of the vaccination programme if we put that in place? Because the point about, as far as I understand it, having the first jab, the second jab, and now the boosters, is because it stops hospitalisations. And that appears to be the case. So we're not comparing, and we're not needing to learn from the past, because we've got the vaccination programme. Otherwise, that was a complete waste of time, wasn't it?
It reduces the risk. It doesn't eliminate it. And when you have something as infectious as Omicron, something like Omicron, which can evade the immune system, so that if you've been vaccinated or you had disease, you're still able to catch this, more able than you were with previous variants. Yes, we will have a smaller proportion of people going into hospital, but they will still be, it'll be a smaller proportion of a very much larger number. So that still means that there will be more admissions.
What would you say, though, to those who are listening now who are saying you're just scaremongering?
Well, we'll know in a few weeks' time. If I'm wrong, then people will have restricted that what they do a little bit. They'll have had a fewer activity meetings with people. If I'm right, then many people will die. Now, is that a risk anybody's prepared to take? It seems to be Boris Johnson's line. Some of you will die, but that's a risk I'm prepared to take, quote, as from the famous film. But is that what other people want to do? Do you really want to go out and have fun knowing that people will die as a result?
You see, again, I think that is scaremongering on the basis that if you if you take the view that you are at risk from this thing, if you have chosen not to have the vaccine and chosen not to have your booster, well, that's kind of your lookout and that's your decision. If, however, you've had the vaccines, you've had the booster, we are still seeing restrictions on people's lives. We have to learn how to live with this thing. And there are plenty of other things which are dangerous to people's lives. And yet there are a lot of people who would say, yeah, but my freedom is more important than having restrictions every time there's a flu outbreak, every time there's something else. It is a risk to people. We know that. And we know that there are risks to people's health and their lives and their livelihoods. But think about all the damage the other side of this. If we have another lockdown, then we're talking about people's jobs.
We're not talking about lockdowns. We're talking about sensible measures.
They're not sensible measures.
Spread.
How can you tell me that what's happening in Wales and Scotland is sensible?
And
that is jobs, that is livelihoods, that is existence of people's lives. It's a complete and utter nonsense.
Is having the virus running rampant. If you have the virus running rampant, that does more harm to the economy than some short-term.
I don't think it does. I think it's proved now that it hasn't. What was the point in the vaccination process then?
The vaccination program does reduce the risk. It doesn't eliminate it. If you have vast numbers of cases, you will still have enough cases, despite vaccination, to overwhelm the NHS.
So why have the numbers in hospital not gone up significantly since this outbreak? This outbreak has been going on long enough. We've known that it's been there for a few weeks.
We've got more people. We've had more hospital admissions than the numbers are going up.
Yeah, it's gone up by 12%.
Do you understand how exponential growth works?
Yes, I
Things
do.
Double every few days.
Yes, I do.
So we can expect them to double every few days. And it won't take many doublings for that to rise to vast numbers, which will overwhelm the health service.
I don't think it will. I think you're scaremongering.
I think you don't know what you're talking about. I think that the science, all the scientists who know about these things are really, really anxious for the health service. All these people finding pretexts for saying it's not that serious. We don't need to worry about it.
I'm not saying that it's not serious, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't monitor it, but I'm just saying that the decision by the Welsh government and the Scottish government would appear to be an overreaction.
Okay. Who's the public health consultant?
Well, just because you're a consultant doesn't necessarily mean that you can see into the future.
We don't need to see into the future. We can look at all the previous waves and see what has happened.
You can't, because you're not taking into account the vaccination program, which has been exceptionally successful. And if you're telling me that the vaccination program isn't doing anything at all, if it's doing something, yeah, I'm afraid your argument makes no sense. Either the vaccination process was a complete and utter waste of time, or it allows us to live with this thing.
It's the proportion of people who get sick. We still have nothing like enough people have had 3 doses for the population to be protected.
When we've got 20,000 people in hospital, then by all means say, let's have some restrictions. Until then, to my mind, it's complete and utter nonsense.
Wait until there are 20,000 people in hospital, and there are going to be 40,000 in a few days' time because it doubled. Then
okay. So I'm on all week. I'm on all week. If it goes up and we suddenly see going up from 7,000 people in hospital, not necessarily from, but with COVID, because we know that there are a lot of people who are in hospital with other things and they happen to have COVID, or alternatively, I find it absolutely incredible that even after all this data, even after all these numbers, even after all this stuff, and I'm not against vaccines and I'm not against lockdowns if the conditions are right, by the way, compared to perhaps some of my colleagues or indeed elsewhere. And I totally understand the need for it. But I do think that some of the things that you are pushing for are dangerous for society.
What we really want to see is doing the thing that we're getting to the stage where it may be necessary to have lockdowns because the doubling rate is so high and there are so many cases. And despite what you say, it would be extraordinarily unlikely for there not to be a huge number more hospital admissions, and which we can't cope with. The NHS is already very strapped. Was before we
it must be able to cope with them. They had 30,000 before and they've got 7,000 now, which is hardly a rise in the last month.
The consequences are we now have, not only do we have
the
rising
consequences of listening to people like you who are scaremongering is that this country goes into another lockdown, or that we put in restrictions that we don't need. People's mental health is interrupted. People's livelihoods are interrupted, and the NHS becomes a complete and utter mess as a result of taking the wrong decisions. Arguably, Boris Johnson on this one occasion has taken the right decision. Oh, and he's gone.